It's no secret that British prisons are full, with a recent study suggesting English and Welsh prisons are at 99% capacity. And today's news merely confirms this. The Lord Chancellor, Alex Chalk, announced burglars and shoplifters will be released from prison up to 60 days early. And while this doesn't include Category A prisoners, such as those who are guilty of violent or sexual crimes, the policy undermines the justice process. If the government needs space in our prisons, the answer is simple, and it's something I thought the government was planning to do: deport the foreign criminals. Nearly 12% of people in prison are foreign, making up 10,000 of a total of 85,000. With the average cost per prisoner at about £48,000 a year, this means the British taxpayer is paying nearly £500 million a year on these individuals. Surely there's no simpler way of freeing up space than by deporting those people and permanently banning them from entering the UK, which we can do now we've left the EU. In the old days, we couldn't ban EU nationals. They could come back. Michael, 10,000 spare spaces would be a great benefit.
Yeah, I think this is the right thing to do. I don't say that with any great enthusiasm, because people, they were sentenced to a certain term and they knew what they were getting. And if everybody thinks, well, it's going to be, X days shorter in reality, that means the prison is less of a deterrent. On the other hand, you've got the benefit, if they're in prison for a bit less time, they've got a bit less chance of learning appalling other ways of being criminals. So, there comes a point where all the prisons are full and all the police cells are full, and then what do you do?
Yeah. I suppose that's the point. But the one thing that concerns me is, and you must see this again and again, the honesty in sentencing. That people get sentenced to 10 years in prison, and they don't serve anything like 10 years. And this always seemed to me to be misleading for the public.
You parliamentarians put this stuff forward. You do the sentencing guidelines with the Sentencing Guidelines Council, and it's very, very sensible. We send more people to prison than the whole of equivalent in Europe. But let's go back to the thing. Burglars, let's release them. There is a contempt for people who've been burgled in this country. Very often the police don't turn up at all. And for many people, it's almost like a rape of their property. Everything has sometimes been destroyed, or there's people who, defecated on the floor. It's absolutely appalling. People don't turn up, nothing much happens, and it feels like a let-off. Now, there are lots of people in prison who shouldn't be there. Drug addicts. Let's do more for rehabilitation and things like that.
Okay, but then a lot of drug addicts commit burglary.
Yeah. But let's solve the problem. Let's put them in rehabilitation. Let's deal with that difficulty, and then they won't be in prison. Drunks, they shouldn't be in prison.
And the trouble is that all of these solutions to, all of these alternatives to prison and dealing with drug addicts and so on, drug takers and so on, are costly. And the Department of Justice, which...
But it stops the problem.
It may do.
Yeah.
But the budget is tighter in this part of public spending than in most. And that is another problem. I mean, if there was lots of money to invest, you can see all sorts of ways out of this.
There's a great myth about sentencing. When I was 12-year-old, my grandfather was murdered. He was sentenced to death. Do you know how long he actually got? 7 years in prison. Now, the minimum nowadays would be 15 years and plus. So when people say in the old days the sentences were harsh compared to now, they are totally, utterly wrong.
A lot of them have hardly changed, actually. They're broadly the same. You look at the 1930s and now. There was less crime in the 1930s.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. There was less reported crime.
Well, there seems to have been less crime.
Well, that's an assumption. Assumption is the mother and father of all mess-ups.
But, Jerry, I think you encapsulated the conundrum. You say, first of all, burglary is a horrible, horrible crime, which it is. And then you say, but actually prison isn't working because they're drug addicts. And isn't this the political problem? You want to respond to the horror of the crime, but what we're currently doing doesn't seem to work. And it's not just whether they're in for an extra 2 months or not.
No,
it's more fundamental than
Jacob,
that.
that's not the problem. The police are not going to houses, by and large, who have been burgled.
All right. Well, we're joined by a former Metropolitan Police detective, Peter Bleksley. Peter, thank you very much for joining me. Jerry's point about not attending burglaries is very important, isn't it? Because if you're not catching the burglars in the first place, if you take 60 days off their sentence, it doesn't really matter.
Indeed, and there are far too few burglars being arrested and charged these days because the police are simply not investigating burglaries in a manner that I would like to see them investigating it. And of course, we've got chief constables using deceptive language by saying our officers will attend to every burglary. Well, there's a huge difference between attending a burglary and investigating a burglary properly. Awesome. So 88,200 people in our prisons at the weekend. Yes, this early release scheme is regrettable. I wish it didn't have to be done, but simply some space has to be freed up for more dangerous offenders who are going through the courts as we speak. The unfortunate thing is that the government's programme of building extra prisons, which really got into gear in 2020, has been frustrated by planning application issues and the such like, and all those extra prisons that were due to come on stream next year are probably going to be delayed till 2027 or thereabouts. But really, they cannot lay those bricks and put the bars in the windows quick enough.
Fast enough. And tell me, how did you investigate burglaries when you were doing it to make sure that people got caught and got prosecuted and went to prison?
Well, every burglary was attended and the scene was properly researched and investigated, together with what in those days were called a scenes of crimes officer. Now people are more familiar with CSI and the such like, that sort of terminology. But of course, not only did we go to the scene of the burglary, but we knocked next door and we went to the neighbours on the other side of the house as well. And perhaps if we had the opportunity, to neighbours over the road. And on more than one occasion, people would say to me, do you know, that's funny. Only last night I was in the garden and I found a glove and it's not mine. And then all of a sudden you get the evidence bag, call the SOCO in, and perhaps you're going to start getting a really good trail of evidence to catch people who are responsible. Burglary is difficult. Detection rates have never been very, very high, but they were higher in the days of Operation Bumblebee. And the simple fact is, if you don't investigate it, you'll never know whether it was easy to solve or not.
And this is a question of policing priorities, isn't it? Because there are as many police as there ever have been, but clearly this isn't the focus. And it could be, because from what you're saying, if you're diligent about it, you do get the clues, you do get the prisoners.
Well, yes, you have a far greater chance of arresting people, certainly. Yeah, senior police officers have told us in recent weeks and months that they will attend, or certain officers have. But as you quite correctly point out, it is not a priority. And in policing, there's that old saying that when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. Chief Constables...
May I ask Peter a quick question?
No, we must move on, unfortunately. But thank you, Peter. Really interesting. I hope you'll come back on again.